So we are, I don't know. I mean, I thought of this topic when I actually read your book, when we were asked to title this session. So I thought Nusrat's book brought to my mind a perennial theme in feminist, um, as a perennial concern of feminism, which is belonging. This whole the, in the crisis of belonging to which large sections of the world's people are put. So, where do you belong? And what are the terms under which you are allowed to belong? Hmm? So, I just want to start with a couple of clarifications on what we mean by belonging. When we say that, when we use that term, and how it differs from some, say, for something like attachment. So, belonging is has to do with feeling at home. Feeling that you are, safe. So, this whole understanding. So, in if you define belonging like that, something like Me Too is really about belonging. It's about feeling safe, feeling unsafe, of course, but the desire to feel safe. And therefore, it has something to do with belonging. So I have a feeling that if you go, extract layers from many feminist concerns, you will probably arrive at this rock bottom of wanting to belong, wanting to feel safe, wanting to be at home. So, how is it different from attachment, maybe? Yeah, attachment is something I suppose the lesser party has, that is not necessarily belonging. You may be attached to a place, but you may not belong there. Those who belong are necessarily have an attachment, but those who have an attachment do not necessarily belong. And that, I think, is at the bottom of much of the poignancy of this theme. It is very poignant because there is an emotional investment, and that counts only as attachment. And if it is indeed to be belonging, then the others, and usually the superior party in that space, has to see you, has to hear you, has to be able to touch you. That's the only time when you actually belong. And that is why I think feminism, right from its inception, has always been talking about belonging. Do you belong to the family? Women are identified with family. Women are identified with community, caste. But do they belong there? Women are attached to these because they are born in it. They are psychic. So we have a large literature in feminist psychology, for example, which is trying to probe, feminine attachment. What is there anything unique about women's attachment to their homes, their spaces? Uh, and then, of course, you know that you are attached, but you very often don't belong. So I want to ask Nusrat, because Nusrat's fabulous book, I hope you all read it. It's a beautiful book. It's a long story of, you know, discovering, because you have to be self reflexive in order to understand that you don't belong. There is a moment in life, suddenly it dawns upon you that you don't belong. I think for a lot of us feminists, that is the moment you turn to feminism. When you suddenly realize that despite your deep attachments to your family, to your community, to your institution, to maybe even your circle of political friendships, suddenly you realize you don't belong. And that's when you often turn towards, that is a moment of revelation that makes you think about, feminism, the politics of belonging, that is. So this is a book, when I read your book, I loved it because it shows how, people have a sense of belonging, then it turns out to be so shallow, then they realize, but then they have agency, they don't just disappear because they don't have belonging, they try to construct a belonging. In other words, they bring into their lives the politics of belonging, and then how something solidifies it, then they discover, well, here too you don't belong. So seems to be a kind of endless journey of finding roots and then finding that, So, can you tell us something about this in the light of your book?
Um, Thank you so much for the generous compliments on this land. So, in my book, I've chronicled my maternal history over a period of 100 years and laid it parallel with India's history and how events have influenced each other. Because I think people's histories is what makes the nation's history. So events are interlaced and they're not like just existing independently. So I've spoken about my maternal ancestors being from a outcast tribe called Bhatus, and my great grandfather had 7 daughters, and this is early 1900s. How I call him my great grandfather the first feminist of the family because he kind of like Devika's talking about belonging. Belonging is also attached to visibility. There can be a system trying to run you down where you are trying to find the safe spaces, you're trying to belong, but you can still not be very visible to people, to law. And in the case of criminal tribes, as my great grandfather's caste tribe was criminalized by law under the colonial rulers, they were there, they were very much there on paper, but they didn't exist as people. There was a roll call, they would be, like their personhood was nothing. It was just an idea of a criminal tribe because the rulers and the upper caste were suspicious of their non sedentary lives. And of course, when you're pushed in society, you have to do certain things for existence. So there were people who were criminals as well, but they were not defined by that. So when we are talking about, like, there were events in the book which led to these people looking for succor in something else. They found that in changing their religion. And then again, like Devika said, that it's belonging is also a sense that evolves, like identity. So you are always looking for something more for safety. And this is the recurrent theme. There are multiple conversions that happen in the book. Daughters in the early 1900s study nursing when in India, women were hardly studying. So there's a cost to that sense of agency when they converted. They were uprooted from their tribal origins and gentrified, as we'll call it. But this is all in quest of fitting in, of belonging somewhere. And that kind of, the book ends with the CA and RC protests. That very thing in itself is questioning a very large chunk of Indian citizens' idea of just being citizens. Like they don't belong here. We have, if I may take the liberty to say, we have a political system now that establishes that you can't really ever be a citizen. You can't ever really belong to India because your holy lands are not here. So it's a process. It's
Yeah, I totally agree. And this last, every time the question of belonging is evoked, it is so poignant. In fact, one of the most poignant and powerful titles I have ever encountered in the feminist literature is a sentence. It says, "All the women are white, all the men are black, but some of us are brave." This is because this is coming from Afro American feminists, who find that in every state political statement you will say you the black people and feminists, black people and women, as if black people meaning black men, so, and women meaning white men, white women. So what happens to the black woman? So there is in that crack, through the crack slips the slip, the black woman is concealed, and the denial of visibility and voice is has been a major trigger. So remember, this text is actually a critique of majority white feminism, which claims to be a majority position, claims to be a majority position. So now in India, this becomes very poignant because I think India, at least Nehruvian India, with all its problems, with all its developmentalism, with all its projection of, continued oppression of the so-called the criminalized tribes under in the modern dispensation, the developmentalist dispensation. Despite all that, this was an imagination of India that was rooted in what could be called development, not in the economy, actually the economy. But now we seem to have moved into something, an imagination of India which is rooted in majority culture, which means that large sections of the Indian population, in fact, the literal majority of the Indian population, is out of that imagination. They have been denied what is called belonging. And I thought this was an interesting topic because while parts of the nation and the minorities in the nation, whether it's cultural minorities, whether that is development minorities, and one of the great insights of Nusrat's book is that when these coincide, when you have a development minority which is also a cultural minority, that is the place where this kind of exclusion hits the hardest. So I think while we are going through this, and of course the CAA, notorious CAA, which was against which the entire nation protested, was precisely an effort to intimidate, to remove belonging. And we have been seeing in many North Indian states what has come to be the bulldozer Raj. So literally the home is demolished. So, and that is interesting because, of course, terrible, but that is interesting because belonging has to do with ultimately a concrete place. So, psychologically, if you destroy that concrete place, you also intimidate that person and remove, their sense of belonging altogether. And of course, with no heed to what might happen to those selves after, they can't go somewhere, right? So what will happen to them? They will be criminalized. They can be labeled as anti-national. They can be incarcerated. Now, but however, feminists do have some experience with this kind of uprooting earlier. And we've had great scholars, activist scholars here in India. Ritu Menon, for example, Urvashi Butalia, many others who have studied this, who have studied the politics of belonging and how women grow new roots. So, so they have one thing that they've pointed out is how this, their work is on the partition period, and how women of one region of Pakistan and India were exchanged, and the kind of pathos, the kind of poignancy that they experienced, it comes out very powerfully in these writings. But one of the things that they point out is how the patriarchal family on either side of the border is such that women will be deeply attached, but they scarcely belong. And sometimes when I read their work, I think, and your work also, when I read it, I felt it, that when they are exchanged across the border, when they are forced to leave the place of attachment and are thrust into another space where they're expected to form new attachments, they actually survive in very, very interesting ways. And in fact, they seem to survive better than men who are forced to migrate. Can you share your thoughts on this? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I've kind of touched on this when I write about my great grandmother Kalyani, who was also forced to, because of a certain event in Rajasthan where they were living, they were forced to leave the religion, change their religion, and shift from Rajasthan to Uttar Pradesh. It was Kalyani's resilience more than Hardyal, my great grandfather. For Hardyal, life started. He went to a seminary, he started studying Christianity. But for Kalyani, her life changed in more ways than one because she's the one who stayed behind. She's the one who had to find new friends, find a new language to fit in, change her dressing, send her daughters to boarding schools. So everything changed. And it is this quest of, rebuilding all the time. And like you rightly said, that's women who are pioneering that. And I mean, we see that everywhere, even now, when we talk about displacement of families, like we spoke about demolitions. What do we leave behind, and what is the effect of a woman's position in society when you take away so much? Because you're calling a woman a householder first, so she is the house for you at one point, and then it doesn't matter that you've taken away everything. And the other thing is the insistence on everything being the same in India. Like we have this suspicion now with anything that's a little different. Everything has to be, like whether it's pure vegetarian to pure breed to pure anything, Sayyadism, Brahmanism. So this obsession with homogeneous identities also affects a lot of people who intersect between this, whether it's multicultural identities or it is Dalit identities, because nobody really speaks about how this is affecting the female population of these communities. And I think that a lot of activism is happening in that, from women finding communities that they can fall back on. So
Yeah, and I was also thinking again in the light of your book and also some other work. So the kind of dilemmas this puts women to, on the I mean, this brings us to the terms under which women are granted a sense of belonging, even if it is not really belonging, a sense of belonging, that is. And this sense of belonging is very precarious. It can be taken away at any point of time. It's so, but then women still value that sense of belonging. So, for example, women have to belong on different terms, So, in Kerala, for example, in the 19th century, these new caste communities which were coming up, women had to necessarily surrender their bodies to reproduce the caste blood, if I may say so, through endogamy. And endogamy was the rule. I mean, you may call it renaissance, you may glorify it in any way. I mean, the Kerala story is like supposed to be very different. So you may glorify that story in any fashion, but the bottom line of all social reform in Kerala was endogamy. And which meant that caste would be reproduced and it was women's bodies. And if you want to belong to your community, you better conform to that. If not, you lose it. So women have tried to contest that different ways. And now in Kerala, right now, there's a movement by some Muslim women. Some Muslim women have come together claiming equal property rights. They don't want to go along with the Union Civil Code. They know the agenda, what that means, but they want equal rights, property rights within the Muslim community. And they are approaching the state for this. So then, I don't know. I mean, the kind of dial, I'm sure those women are going through, if you think about them from their perspective, I'm sure they don't want to be identified as traitors to their own communities because, that's where they belong and that's where they've invested emotionally. But then, if you want any change in that community, you appeal to the state. And that's another, and that state is a cruel state right now. So the terms of belonging that it sets are much more harsh. Much more harsh. So what do women do in this kind of situation? what do women really do? So I don't belong. Yeah, okay, I don't belong to my. I mean, I feel that I don't belong fully to my community because I'm not treated on fair terms. Leave alone equality, not fairly. So who do I turn to? I turn to the state. And this is an evil. I mean, I'm not evil. I'm saying, yeah, it is evil, I must say. It is a terrible state. It extracts a price that will probably, it will not let me belong unless I pay that enormous price. And I think, towards the end of your book, you really bring up that dilemma. So can you speak about it a little bit?
About the ending. So, so my book is divided in three parts. It's my great grandfather's when he was living as a Bhatu tribesman and how they had to face discrimination, and eventually, due to certain events which I've mentioned in the book, and I'm not talking about them now, they converted their life. They bring up their 7 daughters. They turn out to be very successful career women in 1940s. Then my mother gets married to a Muslim, and so there's another conversion in the family. So the third part of the book is about my cultural and religious and political identity, and all three intersect. So, and then I grew up and married a Hindu Bengali person, and we have a son together. So my book questions his identity, not questions, but wonders if the society is going to ask him the same questions that they threw at us. And it happened as well, which is in the epilogue of the book, that the questions remain and people navigate their answers. But it's always linked to one answer on identity and one answer on where do you belong. So, in the title, when I've said this land we call home, that home that I'm mentioning is India. That is the home for us. But under the political scenario that we are living in right now, it is such a layered identity. It is an identity that I can have to prove. If somebody asks me if laws come into place, I have to prove, even though my people have walked on this land as probably the original inhabitants of India. If I have to look at my maternal history, Bhatus, Bhils, they were the original tribes in India. So, but just because we converted down the line, have several other lineages, do we have to still answer that question? Do you really belong to this land? Are you an Indian? And how Indian are you? And the idea that somebody else gets to question you on that is actually poignant. I will agree on that. It keeps you thinking. It leaves me with a little bit of trepidation for my son's identity, because I've also named him in a slightly cosmopolitan way, where his name is Dylan Jaffrey Roy. So you can pick your religion from there and say I'm whatever you want to out of these 3 names. So yeah.
Dylan means the sea. It's a beautiful name. I'm so glad you chose that name. Dylan means the sea, actually, the singing sea. So it's a beautiful name. I'm so glad you chose that name for your son. Now, but you know what? I asked you this question to lead you somewhere else, actually. I was thinking, maybe your book is not about belonging. It's about beyonding. Yeah. Beyonding is, if you to quote Lauren Balan, she says that beyonding is a rhetorical device that we use when you are, when the dominant power refuses to see you, So then you start beyonding rather than belonging, seeking. And it may not be just a rhetorical device, I think. It may be a strategy that people use. Like what? And I think, in fact, what you describe in your book is really beyonding. So, you go beyond. So you seek belonging, then you find that it is partial, then you go beyond, and then beyond, and then beyond. And in the end, you create a luminous network. And this is beautiful because I'll tell you why I thought your book excited me so much. And I've had issues with the way you've written, and issues in the sense, So in terms of craft, etc., these are minor things. Your editor should have taken care of all that, right? So it's your editor's fault, not yours. But I thought it was beautiful because you see, without making any statement of your feminist credentials, so you do talk about early feminists and all that. You don't put, you don't start by telling us how you're a feminist and your feminist orientation led us to, led you to write all that. Don't say that. But it's so beautiful if you look at some of the really interesting feminist fiction that is coming out in India now. And I'll just take two examples. One is Geetanjali Shree's Tomb of Sand. And from Kerala, there is this wonderful book by R. Rajashri, this young author called R. Rajashri. And it's called, in Malayalam, it's called Kalyani Ennum Dakshayani Ennum Peraya Rendu Streegalude Katha. So in English, it's the story of two women, Kalyani and Dakshayani. Now, these texts are really far removed from each other. Rajashri does not, Tomb of Sand, the Hindi version came earlier. The English translation came first, before the Malayalam. Rajashri does not read any English. She does not read English fiction in English. And she really didn't know about Geetanjali Shri at all. So you can't even say that there was some kind of message or communication or anything. But it's so interesting that in both these texts, you have women who, it's all about women having no home, really. That a woman really has no home, no home to belong. So then what does she do? Kalyani and Dakshayani, you have two basically working class women who realize that they don't belong to their homes, they don't belong to the husband's home, they don't belong anywhere. So what do? Basically, they do beyonding, they go beyond. So what they do, and beyonding necessarily involves building loving networks of friendship. So at the end of Kalyani Dakshayani, what you are left with is a luminous map. It's not real space, but it is, you can draw it, you can draw it like a map, a network of illuminating lit nodes. It's a friendship network. It's at the same time, it's a net. It's a net that will catch you if you fall.
It's a
So, and your book is like that too, is it not?
Yeah.
That's what excited me about your book. Do you want to say something about that?
Like I said earlier, identities, belonging, they're evolving. You can feel like you belong to some place, and then events or experiences can sour that. And at some point, at any point, we can feel, okay, do I really belong? Am I really fitting in? And what you mentioned, I would look at it as a safety tools. When we keep moving forward, we keep looking for more to attach ourselves or to help build up or bring up. So these are the safety tools which I think at least women in India have been building now for, if you look at our early experiences, born into a paraya ghar, as they say, then you get married, and then you don't really even completely belong. But you find networks between these two homes, and you still manage to call something a house or a home. So, yeah.
And I have a feeling patriarchy actually gives us these cues early in our lives. I don't know if any Malayali woman here, I'm sure all of you would identify with this. I don't know, maybe the youngest ones won't. But all of us, when we are growing up and we are saying something assertively, we are told that Meengariya pole valakkathadi or Chandapannangala pole oche edukkadadi, which is to say, stop yakking like a fishwife, or stop, shouting like a market woman. So basically, they've already given us a cue who we are actually. If you want, the thing is, you want to beyond, that's where you go. That is, if you want to seriously beyond, beyonding as a verb, then you have to connect to these women. That's where you connect, you know. So patriarchy is already giving us cues. Or it says adjust. Which Malayali woman in this audience hasn't heard the advice to adjust? Everyone, I suppose everyone. Haven't your parents, your teachers, your, senior friends, mentors, they must have all told you to just adjust. So what is adjust? Adjust is to be happy with what you have. Just be, So this is one of the terms under which you can belong. So you know what you have to attack. So I think feminists pick up these cues and politicize them. So that's what that's what feminism essentially does. It picks up these cues that patriarchy throws at your face, and instead of feeling intimidated by those cues, instead of being, scared by those cues, you seize them and you turn them into weapons. So someone says, don't shout like a market woman. You will still shout, and you'll say, okay, I prefer to be a market woman rather than sit at home and weep, right? Yeah. And likewise, if you're told to adjust, you would say, fine. So what? Let everyone adjust. Let everyone in this house adjust, not just us. That's what you would say. That's what you would demand. So that's what feminism would require you to do, to pick up these cues, and instead of being intimidated by them, you turn them into powerful weapons of your own. And yeah, and I think I myself, in my life, I stopped being scared by patriarchy. Or, the terrible thing about not belonging is fear. You feel insecure, you feel ungrounded, you feel that the ground beneath your feet has gone. And that exacts a psychological toll. So in my life, I know that my turnaround was when I realized that you can actually beyond. You don't have to belong. You can really, and that is one reason why so many young women in Kerala desperately want to study outside Kerala. Because the great thing about university environments is nobody forces there to belong. You can beyond. Is it not? So many young women here, and some of you must be studying in other places, or even college, even college which is away from your home. The thing about public spaces for like educational institutions is you are allowed to beyond. You can criticize that institution, right? You're not expected to, be loyal like home. But then when you're forced to do that, see, half the trouble with Kerala's political parties is that they expect women to belong. I was in a session with the noted woman legislator and politician K.K. Rama the other day. So it's so interesting because she was asked questions by two men, and both of them were questioning her, belonging, So they were literally telling her, belong. If you can't belong somewhere, come to us. We will give you this space. You be secure here. Don't complain. Then another guy was saying, we have given you, we have let you belong to us, and you are not grateful enough. So that's why politics in Kerala is an extension. The logic of the family extends into politics. And that is why you don't see notable politicians, women, female politicians from Kerala, but academic spaces have produced Malayali women of considerable critical intelligence and determination. So, what would be your experience? Because I also want to bring to focus your career in film. And you know that right now, the Hema Committee report is a huge explosion that has bust every myth of women belonging to Malayalam cinema.
Yeah, it's incredible what that committee has highlighted, and that was a ticking bomb. And I'm actually very sad that Bombay hasn't caught up and is speaking, but that's how Mumbai film industry is. It's very safe. And we were talking about taking space because, like in house family structures, the politics, there's already politics and there's already a local politician in the house. Like it'll be your tayaji or your father or your grandfather. So we tow around the politics of that person mostly. But when you come out, you get the space, the agency to speak and question. So that's why one, the education is important to step out. But for Bombay, because I work as a as a cinematographer. I said female cinematographer erroneously, but yeah. So it's a largely male-dominated area, and I think so much of just existing there for 20 years is what I would pat my own back for, because you have to just be there. It's the all your everything difficult that can be put your way is put, and oftentimes your name is just cancelled in the name of the producer. It doesn't even come to the boardroom or to a room where people will discuss your credentials and say, okay, we can bring her on. So you are fighting people's perceptions of your craft and technique even before it has come out of their mouth. But HEMA committee has, of course, pointed out a lot of very, very serious issues. I am talking about getting fair opportunities here, nothing compared to, sexual harassment and other deeper issues. If you do manage to get a gig, if you do manage to get a shoot, you have a different level of performance game that you have to keep catering to. That I've done that. Like, actually, I've been someone who's been very vocal. Like, for example, we didn't have Luz on our set on one occasion when I was shooting a web show for Amazon Prime, and I wrote an email at the end of the day. And that didn't go very well with the producers, because they wrote back to me and said, the line producer said, but we took care of it. We took you to a cafe later. So we had to buy coffee for me to go and pee. And I held for the last shot. I kept holding and holding, and I was like, okay, fine, we'll go do it, because I also have to shoot. But I didn't take it sitting down. I wrote an email, and the makers of that show still talk about it. So these are small things.
Yeah, actually, belonging is so much about respect for bodies, you know. If your body is not respected, the needs of your body, basic needs, are not respected, then how can you even talk about, you will be attached, but you definitely don't belong, right? Yeah.
And like I early on said, that you're going to have to make your space. So my career has been about making opportunities myself, making space, getting my own chair to the room. And that's the way you have to navigate. People are not going to come to you, then you'll have to go to them. You'll have to push for yourself. When I was a new mother, I went on to shoot like 6 months into post pregnancy, and I remember carrying a pump, and I expressed in the bathroom. I took like 30-40 minutes, and I came out and I told the first AD I was doing this. I'm sorry, but we needed to do it. So, you have to keep telling why you're doing this,
No.
because you can just hide and say, oh, mujhe time lag gaya, or you can just tell what you were doing, so that maybe they didn't think about it. They should be more mindful also. So you spread a little, because as women, we are told to contain ourselves. You are allowed to spread. Take your space.
So it's actually, belonging is about the dominant party actually taking cognizance of you, and not in that asymmetrical fashion. It's in a sense, you cannot think about belonging unless that asymmetry is actually dismantled. Because otherwise, the problem is asymmetry is not equality, inequality. See, if you may have the same numbers on both sides, but if the structure is asymmetric, one side is definitely going to be below the other side. That's for sure. So, if we're talking about belonging, then I think the asymmetry that is the nature of almost all structures under patriarchy will have to be dismantled. and rebuilt. And yeah, right. So now I suppose we have some time for questions. Would anyone like to ask a question?
അതായത് ഈ തൊഴിൽ ചെയ്യുന്ന സ്ത്രീകളുടെ അവരുടെ ഒരു ജീവിത പ്രശ്നങ്ങളും അങ്ങനെയുള്ള പുസ്തകങ്ങളുണ്ടല്ലോ. അങ്ങനെയുള്ള പുസ്തകങ്ങൾ അവര് അവരുടെ അനുഭവങ്ങൾ എഴുതുന്നത്. അപ്പൊ അങ്ങനെയുള്ള പുസ്തകങ്ങൾക്ക് സ്വീകാര്യത ഉണ്ടാവുമോ എന്നുള്ളതാണ് എൻ്റെ ചോദ്യം.
അത്തരം പുസ്തകങ്ങൾക്ക് മാർക്കറ്റ് ഉണ്ടോ ഇല്ലയോ എന്നുള്ളത് ആ പുസ്തകം എങ്ങനെ എഴുതുന്നു എന്നനുസരിച്ചിരിക്കും. ആ പുസ്തകം എഴുതുമ്പോൾ അനുഭവത്തിന്റെ ഒരു തീവ്രത, അനുഭവത്തിന്റെ ഒരു എന്താ പറയാ യുണീക്നെസ്, അത് മനോഹരമായി പ്രകടിപ്പിക്കുന്ന പുസ്തകങ്ങൾ പലപ്പോഴും വളരെ കാര്യമായിട്ട് വളരെ സ്വീകാര്യമാകാറുണ്ട്. അപ്പം അതിപ്പോൾ സ്ത്രീകളുടെ കാര്യം അവിടെ നിൽക്കട്ടെ, പക്ഷെ അതല്പം ബംഗാളിലെ മനോരഞ്ജൻ വ്യാപാരി എന്ന് പറയുന്ന ഒരു തൊഴിലാളി, അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ ജീവിതം എഴുതിയിട്ടുണ്ട്. പക്ഷേ അദ്ദേഹം എഴുതിയ നോവലുകൾ ഈ പറഞ്ഞ പോലെ തൊഴിലാളികളുടെ ഭാഷയിൽ തൊഴിലാളികളുടെ നിലയിൽ നിന്നിട്ടാണ്. എത്ര വലിയ വായനക്കാരാണെന്നറിയോ അതിനുള്ളത്. അതിൻ്റെ ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് പരിഭാഷ വളരെ നന്നായി ചെയ്ത പരിഭാഷയുണ്ട്. ആ പരിഭാഷ നമുക്ക് പരിഭാഷ വായിക്കുമ്പോഴറിയാം ആ ബംഗാളിയുടെ ആ ഒരു അടരുമായിട്ട് ഈ പരിഭാഷകർ നടത്തുന്ന ഒരു ഒരു സ്ട്രഗിൾ. കാരണം അതിനെ ഇംഗ്ലീഷിലേക്ക് കൊണ്ടുവരാൻ അവർ നടത്തുന്ന സ്ട്രഗിൾ. പക്ഷെ വളരെ മനോഹരമായ പുസ്തകങ്ങളാണ്. അതുപോലെ സ്ത്രീകളുടെ അനുഭവങ്ങളെക്കുറിച്ചും എഴുതാൻ സാധിക്കും. അങ്ങനെ എഴുതിയിട്ടുമുണ്ട്. ബാമ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ തമിഴിലെ ഒരു എഴുത്തുകാരിയുണ്ട്, ബാമയുടെ കറുക്ക മലയാളത്തിലൊക്കെ വന്നിട്ടുള്ള പുസ്തകമാണ്. അതൊക്കെ വായിച്ചു നോക്കൂ, അതിൻ്റെ ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് പരിഭാഷയുണ്ട്.
Hello, ma'am. My name is Nayantara. The question I wanted to ask you, I basically wanted to raise 3 points, but it's around this one question. Can you ever find the sense of belonging, the sense of home, especially considering the fact that the language that we use is extremely reflective of the structures that we have to deal with? You know, the theorist Jacques Lacan would say, it's name of the father. How a child gets introduced into the symbolic order with a patriarchal language. And secondly, I was reminded of a critique called Asta and her theorization of social properties, how we are sort of forced into certain communal and institutional categories, often against our will, and we are supposed to sort of navigate through that situation. And the third point that I wanted to raise was this idea of beyonding. Do you think this idea of beyonding is again a sign of privilege? Recently I read this article how women in Afghanistan were not even allowed to sort of communicate with each other. Their voices are not supposed to be heard. So don't you think this idea of belonging comes with social mobility? And don't you think many women in India are denied that sort of privilege? Thank you.
Yeah, very good questions. Thank you, Nayantara. I think your first 2 questions have to do with the question of agency in patriarchy. Well, that's a very highly debated question. So I think, I mean, to summarize maybe the insights of that debate, I think now there is much consensus that there is no such thing as agency that will just flip through all of patriarchy, which will just throw patriarchy away and, there's something called pure agency that has nothing to do with any kind of patriarchy. So that kind of romantic understanding of agency, I don't think is really, very popular anymore, because there are too many good arguments against that kind of understanding of agency. So agency, I think, is understood as essentially unstable, precarious, but nevertheless real. So yes, and also, by the way, you're looking at psychoanalysts, also read the feminist psychoanalysts who are quite critical of Lacan and of, the early childhood experiences by which children are, inducted into, a society and culture. So, but then, yeah, they have interesting arguments about how this early childhood processes, produce belonging, and how patriarchal belonging can actually finally build up into a kind of violence. So that's my response to your first question. To the second question, what was it? I'm sorry, I can't recollect your second question. What was it about? Yeah,
about beyonding. I think just the reverse, if you read Nusrat's book, beyonding is actually a risk undertaken by those who have less resources. So, Nusrat's family, for example, they were an oppressed lower caste tribe, which was criminalized by the British. And they are the one, and they sought belonging, and then finding that this is difficult within the order of caste, they begin their beyonding. So, and I can tell you, a lot of the effort that lower caste people in India, I don't like the use, oppressed caste people in India, they have taken the risk of beyonding much more than, I think the, in fact, if you look at what I call the NRI literature of, migration and angst, it's all about belonging, the angst of belonging. It's a very privileged kind of act. I think, and if you look at novels like, say, this is excellent novel which you might like to read in Malayalam by this young author called Mini PC. It's called Verigal. Please read it. And Verigal is again about young Dalit women in the district of Idukki, the mountainous district of Idukki in Kerala, and how these women who very well know that belonging is going to extract a huge price, the terms under which patriarchy demands you to belong are too high to pay. So they beyond. So they get beyond the boundaries of Kerala. They go, they come back, and they build, the three sisters build this network of love. It's a fraught network. It breaks sometimes, and then they reweave it. They make these, they break these networks, they rebuild them, but across space, across India, they actually build these large networks of love. And that's how they beyond. And this is undertaken not by, the privilege. Because you see, for privileged women, they can still negotiate with, with the terms of belonging. They can fight within the structures. For oppressed caste women, perhaps that's not, that's often not a very great investment. In fact, it's not as if they give up belonging to their communities and families. They beyond, and through beyonding, they acquire the ability to negotiate the terms of belonging on, advantageously to them. That is the difference. Yeah. So
Ma'am, I really want to thank you for giving us this term beyonding. I haven't read your book. I hope I can, because I have read both Tomb of Sand and Rajshree's Kalyanim Rakshayanim. And both of them spoke to me personally and a lot of women of my age. I'm 34 now. I grew up in this town, very close by, and I grew up in a non-endogamous, intercaste, interreligious family and went to study in Hyderabad and Delhi thereafter, where many of us became feminists for the first time, if I may say so, because we could go out of our homes, and like ma'am said, none of us actually want to come back at all. This was many years back. But there was also the, inner children in us as women who was negotiating this new university kind of space, but did not actually know what it meant to make these networks then, right? I had just lost my mother, so we did not know how to heal each other in once. We did not know how to heal ourselves. And there was a lot of meandering. And I speak for my friends also. We were lost in some sense. We were meandering, but there was no space for that kind of getting lost in this mainstream kind of a feminist discourse where, even authorial women in power sometimes look down upon the kind of mistakes you made or the idea of getting lost. I mean, I'm actually very emotional speaking about it, because to actually have some kind of conceptual impetus of, of those early turbulent 20s, I would say, where we were all so lost, to call it beyonding so beautifully. Thank you so much, ma'am.
So actually beyonding, we have to think using beyonding, because very often what happens is we are actually beyonding, but we're still understanding as creating new belonging. That's what happened to many of us. We were actually beyonding, but we were treating it like belonging. And we were expecting what you usually expect from belonging. So, for example, we don't realize that many of our friends are also struggling with getting out. They are also beyonding. So, we really didn't realize that. So we expected us to belong to them and them to belong to us. And they are also struggling with, belonging and trying to beyond. So we should have a workshop about beyonding.